All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the Women of the Mayflower. 18 wives accompanied their husbands on the 1620 Mayflower voyage. Only 4 were still alive a year later. Mary Brewster, wife of Elder William Brewster, was one of them. So, being the oldest woman in the community, she took in orphaned children, widowed young adults, and nursed the sick as best she could in their dire living conditions. We're going to learn what it was like for Mary and the other women on their historic voyage to America. And this is led by Kathryn Haueisen, the author of 7 books, including Mary Brewster's Love Life, Matriarch of the Mayflower, as well as Mayflower Chronicles, The Tale of Two Cultures. Let's see here. Kathryn is the descendant of Mayflower passengers, including Mary Brewster, and has conducted extensive research on her life over many years and many continents, I believe. So this is all sponsored by the Friends of the Library and the Corning Community Impact and Investment Foundation. I also want to give thanks to a few libraries who promoted the talk, but in particular Ashland, who had a very impressive number of registrants. And I will thank some more folks in the chat. So all nearly 300 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Kathryn for joining us here tonight. And Kathryn, the floor is yours for the next hour, so you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much. And what a thrill it is to be able to talk to this many people from the comfort of my air-conditioned home and no traffic before or after the event. So thank you all for coming along on this journey. So a little bit about me. Yes, I am related to the Brewsters of the Mayflower, a fact that I grew up knowing. My mother was a reference librarian, and she spent her early retirement years doing all the tedious documentation to verify that before we were all looking up everything online. She was going to libraries. So we love libraries in our family. I knew quite a bit about William Brewster. He shows up in the history books every once in a while, and he certainly was a topic of conversation in our family. But I knew virtually nothing about Mary until I started doing the research for the Mayflower Chronicles book. And one of the first things I learned is that we don't even know what her name was before she became Mrs. William Brewster. There's a few different theories about that, but none have been verified. The other thing that I learned that absolutely floored me was when she sailed on that ship with William, they only brought their 2 younger boys. So she left both of her daughters and her firstborn son back behind in Holland, hoping they would be reunited, but not knowing if they ever would be. And they were reunited eventually, but they were separated for a year from Jonathan and 2 years from their daughters. So that motivated me to learn a lot more about Mary and the other women on that ship, because women didn't get very much press coverage in the 1600s. There are notable exceptions for queens and a few famous people, but mostly women did what their fathers told them till they grew up, and then they did what their husbands told them. And if they didn't have a husband or a father, then they probably did what their sons told them to do. So the women who came on the Mayflower, it was not necessarily their decision to do that. Their husbands had decided that they were coming with them. There are quite a few men who came without their husbands because the men had to wrestle with which was more dangerous, leaving their women at home on the European continent to fend for themselves while they were gone. And it was going to be a very long separation, or bring them along on this ship, and who knows what they were going to be running into and what kind of troubles they would have. So the women who came on the ship had husbands who said, "You're coming with me," and that was that, and off they went. I wanted to add that in addition to only 4 of them still being alive a year later, 3 of those women were about 6 months pregnant when they started the voyage. They had hoped to leave in July and be safely settled in the new continent before their babies were due, but the trip was delayed and they didn't actually take off until September. So we'll get into that. But yeah, 3 of them were pregnant on that journey. Okay, why is this not letting me advance my slides? There we go. So here are the 18 women. I'll talk a little bit about each of them that were on the ship. So you don't need to memorize these names. They will all show up again. Mayflower's Mary Brewster's love life focuses primarily on Mary Brewster. The story is told through her fictional diary and telling her adult daughters, once they were reunited, what her journey had been like in the years that they had been parted from each other. But many of the other women on this list show up in the story because they were her community. They lived together, they worked together, they helped each other tremendously. They all had to pull their own weight or none of them were going to survive. So I want to give you a little bit of background about what their world was like. So the church of the 15th century, and the church then was not optional. Pretty much everybody belonged to a church. They may not like it, but they were expected to be there. And the church had tremendous influence on the political world of their time. The church of the 1500 provided the religious and legal grounds for explorers to seize and occupy any foreign lands that did not already have Christian people living there. That was called the doctrine of discovery. It was put forth in papal bulls in 1452 and 1493, and it basically blessed monarchs to send their people all over the globe claiming the land for whichever monarch got there first. The Christian monarchs conquered cultures in North, Central, and South America, often enslaving or killing the people who were already there. Starting in the 15th century and well into the 16th and 17th centuries, the race was on for European monarchs to claim lands explored by their subjects. Another important part of this was the race to colonize the New World. And so in 1587, Queen Elizabeth I, not the one who just died, Queen Elizabeth I blessed Sir Walter Raleigh to establish an English settlement in North Carolina. They sent a supply ship a year later to see how it was going, and they found no trace of those who had been sent to establish that settlement. There was no evidence of what happened to them. There was no indication of violence, and it is known today as the lost colony of Roanoke. They literally just vanished. Not to be dissuaded, they formed a company called the Virginia Company, and they set off again and established Jamestown in May of 1607. They named it after King James because by then he was the king. Queen Elizabeth had died and King James was now on the throne. They sent 104 English men and boys, no women. The area they chose was surrounded on water by three sides, and so it was not inhabited by indigenous people because it was infested with mosquitoes. And the indigenous people knew better than to try and have a settlement there, but the English did not. And so they set up camp there. Many of the men on that voyage were gentlemen who were not used to any kind of hard physical labor. So they ran out of food pretty quickly, and they had very little experience in gardening their own food. So they were in pretty desperate straits. So the Mayflower came along in 1620, and there were 102 men, women, and children, plus a couple of dogs on that ship. And that journey eventually, in just a few years, paved the way for an influx of thousands of English immigrants. It was a huge wave of immigrants coming in from England. Today, the descendants from those 102 passengers are estimated to be about 35 million worldwide. The estimated indigenous population of the area pre-contact with Europeans was estimated to be around 100,000. The estimated population in 1620, by the time the settlers showed up, was around 30,000 because they'd had a horrible plague that came through. And the indigenous descendants today are estimated to be around 12,000. The map there is the effort by Captain John Smith to draw a map of the New England area. And you probably can't see it very well, but even if you could, it probably wouldn't resemble much of what you know about the New England area anyway. So the story starts in England, in a little village in northern England, not too far from York, called Scrooby. This is what's left of the Scrooby Manor today. It was once an elegant estate, and Mary Brewster became the mistress of this estate when she became Mrs. William Brewster. This is what the estate looked like in its heyday. the part that's still standing that I just showed you is in the lower sort of right-hand corner, just a little bit to the right of center, that rounded part in the lower part there with the two chimneys. That was the manor part of it. And then the rest of it was stables and guest houses and a chapel and just all kinds of things. It was on the road between London and Edinburgh, and that was the main north-south route to communicate between the two countries. So it was a place to change out horses. It was a place to come in and get something to eat, maybe spend the night. Once in a while, the royalty would show up here. It was a very well-known landmark back in the 1600s. This church is about a football field distance away from what the remains of the manor. It was called St. James back when William and Mary Brewster were alive. Today it's called St. Wilfrid. I have no idea why. This is probably where Mary and William were married, and this is probably where their 3 first children were baptized. It is a parish of the established Church of England. And that's important to the story later on, because this is like right there where the manor is. And so to live at the manor and not show up for worship at this church, you would be missed. You'd be conspicuous by your absence. This is a portrait of Mary Brewster as found in Pilgrim Hall Museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We don't know what she really looked like. They didn't have cameras back then, and they weren't doing portraits of women unless they were queens. We think she was born around 1569. One theory of who she was Thomas and Grace Wentworth. This has not been confirmed, but I went with that theory for my books because it worked in well with the story I was telling, because Thomas Wentworth had been the postmaster and bailiff at Scrooby Manor in Mary's childhood. And then he died when she was a very young teenager. And the job went to William Brewster Sr. And so William Brewster, the Pilgrim, grew up in the manor part of his life. And when his father died, Pilgrim Brewster took over his father's job. And when he married Mary, then she moved into the manor, either for the first time or the second time. A key hinge point in this story was in 1587 with the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. That ended Brewster's diplomatic career and brought him back to Scrooby. William had been tapped by Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State and ambassador. His name was William Davison. He traveled up and down that North Road and was a frequent guest at Scrooby Manor, so he was well acquainted with the younger Brewster and recruited him to come and work for him. But then when he lost his job over the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, he came back north to help his father, who was still alive at the time, either met or reconnected with Mary Brewster. We don't know that part of the story. We do know that they were married probably 1591 or 1592 and lived in the manor house. While they lived there, their first 3 children were born, Jonathan in 1593, and then there's a gap in Patience in 1600. This is just my own theory, so do not take this to the bank and try and cash it in, but I think Patience may have been named Patience because there was a long gap between Jonathan and Patience. Fear was born in 1606. Her name is based on the concept of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, not as in being afraid. Things were changing a lot in England at that time, a lot of tension around the nonconformists who didn't like what King Henry had done and didn't approve of the established Church of England. So there was a lot to be nervous about, but they named their daughter after the concept of they were putting their faith in God to take care of them. Then they immigrated out of country. There was a stillborn child in 1609. They had a son, Love, born in 1622, possibly because by then they were their own separate fellowship, lived very close, sometimes with each other, were a very tight-knit community, and they thought that the love that they all shared with each other was kindred to what the first century church must have been like. So we think that's why that son was named Love. I can't imagine if that poor child walked into a classroom today with that name. And then the final son born was Wrestling in 1614, because already in 1614, they were debating whether they were going to stay where they were or try to immigrate over to the New World. That process took several years. So this is about the women on the Mayflower, but their lives were dictated by these men. So on the left is Elder William Brewster, and then William Bradford, who was a young lad of about 12 when he and William Brewster first met. William Bradford is only a year or two older than the Brewster's son, Jonathan, and he was a very close friend of the family. He lived with them a couple of times, and it was just a very tight bond between the two of them. Edward Winslow came from London to help Brewster when he established a printing business, so that we'll get to in a minute. He turned out to have really good diplomatic skills, and so he was kind of an unofficial ambassador between the English settlers and the indigenous people. In fact, he died on his way either to or from England on some kind of diplomatic assignment and was shipwrecked. John Robinson was a much beloved pastor with the community in Leiden. He grew up from about 100 that left England to resettle in Holland, and within a few years had grown it to over 300 people. He was a very well-respected man. And finally, John Carver. He was one of the wealthier people in the story. He did a lot to help finance the journey and served as their first governor. So, Mary Brewster, she lived in exile. In 1607, the Scrooby separatists, there's two strands of the nonconformists that get lumped together as the Pilgrims. The separatists didn't have any regard for the church of their time and wanted to completely separate and try and go back and create a first century kind of a community. The other group were the Puritans, and they didn't want to give up all of the benefits of belonging to a very large church body, but they thought there were some things that needed to change, that it hadn't been reformed enough in the Reformation of 1517. And so they wanted to purify it, and thus the name Puritans. The separatists hired an English shipmaster to take them across the North Sea to their destination was Amsterdam, but the shipmaster betrayed them. Back in those days, they had people prowling around the countryside that were called searchers or enforcers, and they looked for people who were not in church where they should have been, or who were holding illegal services in their homes or in their barns, and they would turn them in, and because there was a bounty on their heads. And so the searchers and the shipmaster agreed to betray these people when they were helpless and already on the ship, and turn them in for the money. So they were marched off to Boston, not the one in Massachusetts, the one in England, for which the one in Massachusetts is named after. They sent the women and children home. They kept some of the men, mostly to harass them. William Brewster was among those they kept. Bradford was still a very young boy at the time, so they sent him back with the women. They walked back to Scrooby, a distance of about 60 miles. They regrouped, and a year later they tried it again, and they got caught again. But the magistrate who had to figure out what to do with them really didn't want to deal with them. So he told them, just leave in small numbers. Don't tell me what you're doing. It's kind of an don't ask, don't tell kind of a situation. So over a period of a few months, they all eventually made it to Amsterdam. And there were quite a few refugees already in Amsterdam. The nonconformist movement had been in place for quite a while, and there were quite a few pastors who had decided to take their chances and take their congregations and go over to Amsterdam, which was a pretty tolerant city. And so there was a community of English-speaking people to connect with. So they moved to Amsterdam, and it was fine until it wasn't. But some of the earlier people to get there had some infighting going on. If you are part of a church, you may be shocked to hear that sometimes church people fight with each other. And the separatists from Scrooby had no stomach for it. They'd already been through a lot. They just wanted to settle down someplace and worship the way they wanted to worship and be left alone. Brewster had been in Leiden before when he was traveling with Davison, who at that moment was an ambassador for Queen Elizabeth I. And they spent a fair amount of time in Leiden. He loved the city. It's smaller than Amsterdam. So they sought permission from the Dutch authorities to relocate down to Leiden, and they agreed. The church that you're looking at there is St. Peter's Kirk. It's no longer a church. It was decommissioned a while ago, but it was a very thriving church when they first got to Leiden, and most of their homes were within a short walk of that church, and that church kind of helped them get settled, just like churches today help immigrants from all different parts of the world come in and help them learn the language and learn the customs and all that sort of thing. They did not worship there. They either worshiped in homes or they found some kind of a community meeting space where they could worship. But their story is preserved at the church. There's information all around, inside and outside the building. John Robinson has actually been interred there. And this is where he was designated their pastor and Brewster was designated their elder, which is sort of like the teacher and the administrative assistant to just, handle the things that have to be done to keep a community working together. This is the University of Leiden. It had opened up not too many years before the Scroobic group showed up there, and Brewster supported his family by teaching English as a second language at this university. It was attracting students from all over Europe. And ironically, then as now, the common language was Latin or English, but they all want to learn English because speaking English is really advantageous for people. So he was teaching English. Mary delivered a stillborn baby here. While they were living there, she took in 2 of William's orphaned cousins who were up in England, and there was no one else in the family who was able or willing to take these children in. They were what we might call grade school age at the time. She and Bridget Robinson, Pastor Robinson's wife, became very, very dear friends. And so one of the heartbreaks of Mary's life was after they sailed to America, after they sailed to North America, they Robinsons had expected to come and join them eventually, but that never happened. And so Mary never got to see her best friend again. And this is where they were living when Love and Wrestling were born. So things were going along pretty well. In 2018, a fellow named Tom Brewer, he was not on the Mayflower, decided to help William Brewster start a publishing business. And so he funded the cost of that and made arrangements to bring Edward Winslow, who worked for a stationery print shop in London, to come down and help. At first, all they were doing was translating theological books from Italian and French and Spanish into English. But then they started publishing documents that were very by now it was King James, and shipping them back into England. Now, they published the books under an assumed name, but it didn't take long to figure out where these books were coming from. And although the Dutch were very tolerant people, they were caught between England to the north and Spain and France to the south, and they needed England to be their protector from countries that would love to get their hands on their real estate. So when sent him back, extradite him back to England, I have plans for him. The Dutch said they weren't going to argue with King James. So William Brewster went into hiding for over a year, which left Mary to manage the 5 children in the household on her own as the community is making their plans to sail off to North America.
So Kathryn, before you advance the slide, I think this is your test to see if I'm paying attention, but I think you have a typo on the previous slide. I think it's 1618, not 2018.
Yeah, it sure is.
Okay. That's what we figured.
Thank you. Once again, proving the theory, the best way to proofread is to go ahead and publish. Yeah, thank you. I'll catch it for the next time. Okay, so this is Leiden. It is a charming city with canals every place. And there's a little plaque there that says that these are the steps that the separatists that came over to North America were on before they got on the boat that take them up to the shore, to the coast, where they caught up with the Speedwell and then sailed across the North Sea to hook up with the Mayflower. I have no idea if that's true or not, but the people of Leiden want to claim it is. And so I say, God bless them, let them claim it. They met the Speedwell in Southampton. William was still in hiding. There are theories that he was moving back and forth under an assumed name, maybe as Mr. Williamson. In those days, you didn't have your picture plastered everywhere, so it was easier to hide. You could, grow a beard, remove the beard, add a hat. There were things you could do to get away with it. But he was in hiding, and Mary still had not seen him. But then finally, they all met up It got on the ship. There were 37 passengers from Leiden. And so when people talk about coming over here to establish a Christian nation, yeah, there are 37 people from Leiden, and the rest of them were from England. They were either coming because they'd been paid to be on the ship to help out. They had certain skills that would be very helpful to a new settlement, or they were adventure seekers, and they thought maybe they'd come over and get themselves a piece of land and start a new life. There's pretty good evidence that they also brought along a couple of dogs and maybe even a few small animals. So it must have been just a very interesting tour. Nothing like the cruise ships I've been on. They left in July, but they had to turn around and come back twice to repair the leaks in the speedwell. On the third return, they said this ship is not going to make it all the way to the other side of the Atlantic and back again. So some at that point gave up and went home, and everybody else and everything that they needed to take with them got crammed into the Mayflower. And they finally took off on either September 6th or 16th. We've used two different calendars, and although I keep having this explained to me, it doesn't really compute in my brain. So pick whichever date you like. They left in September. They arrived in Provincetown 66 days later in November, in the middle of winter. They were several hundred miles off course, and several months later than they expected to arrive. They had been blown off course, or they had been sabotaged, and the ship master intentionally took them off course because they arrived outside the boundaries of the Virginia Company's territory. They're supposed to be at the mouth of the Hudson River, and they weren't. So this caused a lot of problems. The people who were not part of the separatist community decided, well, thanks for the ride, we'll take it from here, and plan to go off on their own. But the leaders of the separatist community thought, there's no way we're going to survive if we don't all stick together. That is why we have the Mayflower Compact. Before they set foot off on the ship, every male either signed it or made an X that was witnessed by somebody. But they finally got there, and then they had a few trips to explore the area on foot some, and they brought a shallop or like a sailboat with them. So they were exploring that. They sailed across Cape Cod Harbor, finally decided that they would settle in Plymouth, and you probably all know the story from there. During that trip, there were 4 orphan children. It's not clear if they were really orphaned or they were just owned by their father once he figured out that he was not their biological father. So they were cast away, and they ended up on the Mayflower, and 2 of them ended up with the Brewster family, and 2 others were assigned to 2 other families as sort of junior servants. So the journey, as I said, 3 women on the boat were pregnant. About midway across, they encountered what sounds like a hurricane. They didn't give it a name. They weren't naming those storms back then, but I've lived in the Gulf Coast for a while. I've seen what hurricanes do. They're pretty horrific. It's really a miracle that they didn't capsize, but they didn't. And because they were going to have to build buildings, they brought along some building tools with them, and they were able to repair the beam that was supporting the main mast to the point where they could keep sailing west. Their living quarters were what's called the 'tween deck. So above that roof that you can see was the top deck, and below that floor that you see was the storage area with everything that they were bringing with them. There were a few cabins, but only a few. Mostly people bunked out in the open area as best they could, in an area that was about 58 by 24 feet. And after they got here, they still had to live on the ship for quite a while because they didn't have any shelter, and it was the middle of winter. So one of the people that you've probably heard about is Dorothy Bradford. She was married to William Bradford. They got married in Amsterdam because that's where her family was. She was very young. I think she was 16. They got married in 1613, and then they relocated to Leiden because that's where William Bradford was already living. He had lived with the Brewsters at first, but once he got married, he got his own place. They were very active in the Leiden Separatist Church. They had 1 son, and when it came time to sail on the Mayflower, their little boy they left him behind with Dorothy's parents. Dorothy fell overboard and drowned while Bradford was off with other people looking for a place to establish their settlement. They were gone for several days. My theory is she was leaning overboard. The deck was slippery. It was probably windy. The boat was rocking. She lost her balance, and she would have been wearing a lot of heavy wool clothes that once they got wet, they would be very difficult to maneuver around. There was a magazine story that came out in about the mid 1800s that suggested that Dorothy and William and another woman that William had his eyes on once upon a time were in a three-way love triangle, and the loss of her son and the reality of what lay ahead of her was just more than she could deal with. That has been pretty well disproved by historians and genealogists, but you will come across that story in documents. Elizabeth Hopkins. I don't have a picture of her because, again, we didn't take pictures of the women. She was born in England. She married Stephen Hopkins in 1617 or 18 in England. And Stephen Hopkins had already sailed to North America once before. He was on his way to Jamestown. He got shipwrecked, survived that amazingly, eventually made it to Jamestown. And while he was there, he learned that his wife had died in his absence. That left small children with basically orphaned unless he went back to England. So he did, married Elizabeth, and they traveled with his children and her little girl from a previous marriage. And while she was sailing across the ocean, she delivered their son Oceanus, mid-Atlantic. Then she traveled with, with her daughter and his two children. She was one of only four that was still alive the next fall. She comes from her sturdy stock. This is, I've got a bar blocking what I'm trying to look at, which is making this difficult. This is Elizabeth Allerton. I can't see this. Can I close the closed caption thing? I don't want to cut you off. I don't want to leave the meeting. But
it's Eleanor Billington is the slide.
Thank you.
In terms of moving the bar, so we don't see it, so you see it.
Okay, well, I'm trying to juggle things to avoid it, but that's not working, and I really don't want to cut you off. So you'll just have to tell me who I'm talking about, because there's a beautiful black bar right across their name. Eleanor Billington was part of the group that they called the Strangers. That was the people from England, not part of the Leiden community. She came with John and their sons, John and Francis, and this family has gotten a pretty bad rap in history. They were pretty adventuresome. They didn't necessarily think rules applied to them. I think it was Francis nearly put the ship on fire one day when he took his father's musket and was experimenting with it, and a spark landed in the barrel with all the gunpowder. Mercifully, the staff of the ship was right there and took care of it immediately. But anyway, she was eventually sentenced to sit in a stock for slander. She was widowed. John died, and she remarried a guy named Greg Armstrong, and she is another one of the four that was still alive a year later.
Kathryn, just a heads up, I think we might have missed a slide. Your first, if you go back, did you have a slide for Mary Ellerton?
Yeah.
There it is.
This is Mary Ellerton. This is an important story. So she also is from England. She married Isaac Allerton in 1611 in Leiden, so they were part of the Leiden community. So she traveled with her husband Isaac, Bartholomew, daughters Remember, and Mary. She was one of the three pregnant women. They had anchored by the time she was ready to deliver, but they were still living on the ship. She also had a stillborn while they were living in Leiden, but she delivered a stillborn baby while they were living on the ship in Plymouth Harbor, and then she died just a few days later. I'm guessing a combination of infections that were common in childbirth back then, and maybe just depression. She just couldn't handle all of it. Then we have the Billingtons, and now are we looking at Kathryn Carver?
We are.
Okay. Kathryn Carver was sister to Bridget Robinson. She married John in England. She was widowed before she married John, and then they were part of the Leiden community. She crossed with her husband John, who became the first governor of Plymouth Plantation, and she died. He died first in April, mostly from heat exhaustion from being out working in the hot sun trying to get a garden in. She died a few weeks later, probably of a broken heart. They had no children, and so she was one of the ones who didn't make it. Rose Standish was married to Miles Standish. He was the hired military escort for the ship. So the English sent him to try and protect them from pirates and just to try and whip them into shape to protect themselves from whatever they run into. She died early on. We don't know very much about her at all. You've probably heard Longstress, The Courtship of Miles Standish. I'm not going to get into all that tonight, but that's the Miles that poem is about. This is Susanna White, maybe? Yeah. She was married to William White, probably in 1614, probably while they were still in Amsterdam. She had a son, Resolved, and then another baby, Peregrine. This is the third pregnant woman who was born while they were living on the ship, but they were anchored. And Peregrine lived to adulthood and has passed on the family gene. She was widowed then when William died, and Edward Winslow, we'll get to in a minute. He was also a new widow, and so the two of them were the first marriage in the Plymouth Plantation in 1621. She was the fourth woman still alive a year later. She lived a relatively ripe old age. We don't know exactly when she died. Then the other women on the ship. There were quite a few, and most of them we don't know anything about. So, for example, Mrs. James Chilton, we don't even know her first name. Her husband was named James. They came with their young daughter, Mary. They were part of the Leiden community. Her husband was one of the very first ones to die. She died not long after that, leaving their 13-year-old daughter orphaned. I'm sure the community took her in. We don't know exactly which family would have taken her in. There is a legend that Mary Chilton was the first female to step foot on the famous Plymouth Rock and therefore onto dry land. It's a nice story. Believe it if you want to. It's never been documented. The picture to the left is Burial Hill. That's not where these people were buried as they were dropping like flies. They didn't have time to do that. They were burying them in the sand and sometimes even propping the corpses up in a sitting up position against a tree with a rifle so that the natives in the area wouldn't realize how many of them had died already yet. So they got around to burying them later. Sarah Eaton came with her husband Francis and a baby. Little Samuel was about a year old. They were part of the Leiden group. She died that first winter. Mrs. Edward Fuller, we don't know her first name. She came with another young son named Samuel, probably from the Leiden Fellowship. Mary Martin is interesting. She came with her husband Christopher, who represented the English group, and he was the governor of the stranger part of the ship and had really caused quite a bit of consternation to the Leiden community. They really didn't want these strangers on the ship with them, but the people financing it said, you either take these people or we withdraw our finances. And so they were foisted on each other. And Christopher tried to take charge of the whole thing. And the Leiden group, who had done the heavy lifting for planning and financing, were equally determined that they would be in charge. Mary died the first winter. Alice Mullins came with her husband and daughter Priscilla and son Joseph, and within a few months of arriving, Priscilla was the only one still alive. She married John Alton, who was also from the English group. Alice Rigsdale came with her husband John. They both died the first winter. They may have been among the older people on the ship. They were perhaps in their 60s or 70s, but this has not been confirmed. Agnes Tilley traveled with her husband, part of the Leiden group. They had no children. Genealogists think she may, though, be related to people as far back as the Doomsday records, but they're not sure about that. Both of them died the first winter. Joan Tilley came with John and their daughter Elizabeth, part of the English group, we think. They both died the first winter. This trip was really hard on people. Mrs. Tinker came with her husband Thomas and a young son who we don't even have a name for, and they all died the first winter. Elizabeth Winslow was a very young bride. She traveled with Edward. Mary Brewster kind of mentored her and taught her domestic skills and kept her company while Edward and William are off doing whatever they were doing with their printing business. She died the first winter, thus making Edward a new widow, and he married Susanna White. Agnes Tilly, we just did that. Why didn't that advance? There we go. Oh, so that's the end of the formal presentation. Both of these stories are told in detail in these two books. The Mayflower Chronicles on the left really focuses on the history in England before they sailed, the history in New England for among the indigenous people before they arrived, and then their first encounters and the challenges of getting the new settlement up and going, and the first treaty that was initiated by the indigenous people in the spring of 1621, and both groups honored it for about 50 years. I was able to track down the descendants of that Native American leader. His name is Massasoit. You live in the New England area, you probably have streets named after him. He initiated that treaty, and his descendants tell me they did honor it for about 50 years. Not perfectly, but pretty faithfully. Mary Brewster's love life is a fictional diary. I had to make up the whole thing. She did not leave any written record behind, but we do know where she was and what was going on in the places where she was. And so it's a combination of her diary and her recollections as she's telling them to her family. And she lived until 1627. So she lived to see a couple of her grandchildren be born and several of her adult children get married. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. There's some more resources if you're really interested in the story. If you're really interested in this, I highly recommend the books by Sue Allen. She's a professional historian, genealogist. She lives in England. She has spent countless hours going through church records and archives of all kinds, doing the really tedious work to track down who was who and how were they related and where were they when and how did they get there and all that sort of thing. So she's got several books out now. I think they're all available through the Pilgrim Hall Museum in Plymouth. Ken Follett is fiction, of course, but he tells a good story. Indians before New England, there was a lot of life on this continent before the Europeans showed up. He's documented some of it. Nathaniel Philbrick is kind of considered the go-to book about the history of the Mayflower. And Strangers and Pilgrims was written by a fellow who opened a pilgrim museum in Leiden. He just died within the past year, but I was going to get his autograph on that book until I got the book and I realized it's 700 pages. I'm not hauling that across the pond with me, so I don't have his autograph. And then, Robert, I can email this to you, and those who want can get a copy of it. Here's some more references that I have used for my research. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this right now. I just want to show you there's a lot. One place I go to all the time, the second from the bottom, or the bottom one actually, is Caleb Johnson's website, mayflowerhistory.com. He has a complete list of all the passengers. He has a wealth of information on there. I go to his website almost daily. And then some more resources. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions or comments that people want to make.
So folks, let's give Kathryn a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And Kathryn, let's take approximately 15 minutes of audience questions and comments. Teresa says this was fascinating. Thank you. Mary Lynn would like to know how many unmarried women traveled on the Mayflower?
I haven't counted, and you have to give me an age. Would that be 16 and up, 18 and up? The answer is not many, because they weren't going to send their unaccompanied daughters on that ship. So unless their families came, they weren't coming. Priscilla Mullins, I know, was one of them. I don't know, but I'll tell you what, mayflowerhistory.com, you could go find out because he's got a complete passenger list.
Shirley says this was very interesting and she thanks you. Another question, why do historians think Dorothy did not jump?
Well, because she was from a very religious family, and that would have been really against their religious understanding about things. It just would not have been done in their understanding of what her religious community would have been like. Her father was a significant leader in the nonconformist movement. Her mother was married to a family that had a lot of influence in the church of their day. And so they just don't think that that's probably what happened. They think it's more likely she fell overboard.
Diane says this was really interesting and she's looking forward to reading your books. Dee said, thank you. I enjoyed this program very much. Diana says it was wonderful. Terry just wants you to confirm. So were 3 of the 4 surviving women, were they from the Leiden community?
Yes, Eleanor Billington was the only one that was a part of the English group. Yeah.
Claudia asks, where did you get the pictures of the women from?
The internet. So I am not claiming that those are true images of those women.
Teresa says, thank you for your information as to the Hopkins family. I am a descendant of Stephen Hopkins.
He was quite the man. Oh my gosh, he was amazing. That book that I showed you a picture of, that's worth getting a copy of. I read that ironically when I was on a cruise across the Atlantic Ocean. And so I was watching the ocean and reading about him getting shipwrecked. It's a really interesting story.
A couple people want us to double check one of the birth dates that you listed in one of the slides, so we can do that afterwards. Terry says, Kathryn, have you ever heard that the Speedwell was sabotaged by its Dutch captain? Have you heard that before?
I have heard that the crew may have sabotaged it because the plan was to bring the Speedwell over and leave it, and then the Mayflower go back home. And they were going to use the Speedwell to do some explorations up and down the coast because this was still pretty unknown territory at the time. And the crew said, yeah, we're not going over there and getting stranded over there. And so, yeah, there is a theory that they sabotaged it, that they intentionally didn't fix the leaks properly. Yeah.
Lots of folks in the chat are pointing out that they too are descendants from folks in the Mayflower. So I just, I'm not going to read every single comment related to that, but we have Larry who notes that William Brewster and William Bradford became a separatist attending All Saints Church in Babworth from the preaching of Richard Clifton. So his questions are, did Mary Brewster also listen to Clifton? And have you been to All Saints Church? I went a few years ago and found it quite inspirational.
I've been to Scrooby. I didn't time it right, so I didn't get to go inside. Sue Ellen apparently periodically, it's private property now, but Sue Ellen has a relationship with the current owners of it, and periodically she's given permission to do tours, but I didn't know that until I'd already been over there and back. So to answer the question, no, I've not been up to that area, but Bradford's story is amazing. He was orphaned. He was living with uncles. They fed him and clothed him, and that's all they did for him. He was pretty sickly. He walked an estimated 7 miles because Clifton kind of took him in as a surrogate father. And then he met William Brewster, who became like another surrogate father or surrogate uncle to him. And those two were very, very fast friends. And Bradford apparently was truly brilliant. Yeah.
See here. Dorothy says Sue Allen's books are published and available at AmericanAncestors.org. They have them available online through their bookstore. Mary would like to know what primarily killed folks that first winter. Was it illness or lack of food or something else?
Well, it was a combination of things. It was a brutal winter. I mean, the ship was not heated and air conditioned. They were running out of food, so their diet was really inadequate. One of them would get the flu, and then everybody would get the flu because they were living in such close quarters. It was a combination of things, but it just really, really rough time. At one point, there were only like a half a dozen or so people who could stand upright to take care of the rest of them. They thought they're going to lose Bradford. He was very sick for a while, but he managed to survive.
Lillian says, great presentation, as does Marion. Claudia says it was terrific. Diane says, interesting. Terry, we already answered that one. Barbara says, fascinating. Thank you so much for your info and your efforts in putting this webinar together. Anne notes that she's descended from John and Priscilla Eldon. Joanne says, thank you very much. Very interesting. I had previously asked about the website familysearch.org. And listing who they say I'm descended from. Do you find that to be an accurate website? Are you familiar with familysearch.org?
Yeah, I haven't used it myself. I certainly have heard of it. It gets mixed reviews. I'll tell you, my go-to people for Mayflower genealogy is Caleb Johnson and Sue Allen. of course, the Mayflower Society, and Pilgrim Hall. They put a lot of hours into researching all of this.
Laura says, how difficult was it to get a spot on the Mayflower?
I don't think that difficult because, to some extent, they thought they might be sailing off the end of the world. I mean, people had been there and come back, so they knew that that was possible. But it was a very, very long journey. I don't know if they knew about Roanoke when they sailed. They certainly knew about Jamestown and how rough that had been. I think the Latin community did a brilliant thing. There were about 300 of them, and they had lots of meetings, and they decided they were going to do this, but they were going to just send a small group. And if that small group succeeded, they would come over in other shiploads until the whole community was relocated. And if they didn't succeed, they would figure out how to get back on some future ship, and then they would have a community to come home to. So they didn't want that many people going from Leiden. So these were kind of the heroes of the community who were willing to do it. On the English side, some of them were paid, like they needed a cooper to repair the barrels. They needed the military escort of Miles Standish. They need people who knew how to garden and produce food and build buildings and stuff. So some of those people were paid, or they had enough money to pay their own way.
So Kathryn, I don't want to go too far past 8 o'clock our time. Let's go for another, let's say 8 minutes or so. So Mary Ann says this was fascinating. Thank you. Can you elaborate a bit on your own heritage?
So my mother was a reference librarian, as I said, and documented that we're related to William Brewster. And I was moderately impressed with that, but not as impressed as my mother had hoped I would be. Typical 20-something-year-old. I've got other things to think about. But life goes on. I got married and had 2 daughters, and one of them went to Texas Lutheran University and married this young man named Rudy Flores. And Rudy Flores's family is the conquest of the southern part of the United States and Mexico. His father is about half indigenous heritage and half Spanish heritage. And I lived in Houston until about a year and a half ago. So we have Rudy's parents, and my husband and I have between us 3 bicultural grandchildren. And so we used to tease them, you are the whole Thanksgiving story. The wrong end of the country, but close enough. So of spending all that time with the Flores family, I began to think, I wonder if their understanding about this is the same that I've been told. And it turns out it's not. In recent years, of course, we've done a lot to try and reset the story and infuse more accurate information. And I think the solution is to be someplace in the middle. Okay, so there were good guys and bad guys, and some things went horribly wrong, but some things went horribly right. But that's what really motivated me to write the story, was to hear both cultures speak.
Larry asks, are you a member of the Mayflower Society? And Susan asks, do you ever meet with the Grand Dame Society, which I guess is a Pilgrim Heritage Society?
I am not, because when I went to apply for membership of the Mayflower Society, I thought my birth certificate proving I was my mother's daughter, her application documents, and her membership card would be enough. And it wasn't. They wanted more documentation from other people that weren't part of the family at the time my mother was applying for this back in the 70s. And so it's on my bucket list of things to do, but I was so busy trying to get the book written. We were trying to get it out for the 2020 400th anniversary, that it was full speed ahead to get the book published. And then I've been a speaker at some Mayflower societies. I'm lined up to be one again in November. And I'm not against it. I just hasn't written to the top of the things yet of things to get done.
Nancy asks, what was your biggest surprise when researching Mary Brewster?
That she left 3 of her children behind. And she left 3 of her kids, both daughters.
Linda asks, did they send William Brewster's body back for burial?
I think he's interred at Burial Hill at Plymouth. I think there's a tombstone there with his name. There is another tombstone right behind the church there at the bottom of Burial Hill. I was just there last fall, I think. And they had dedicated to Mary, and they had Wentworth on there. And then the Brewster Family Society, I was there for one of their reunions, said we got to change that. We cannot verify that's true, and we don't want to be, sending out false information. So I'm pretty sure William is buried at the top of the hill. He outlived Mary by a few years and never remarried. He was pretty elderly by the time she died. Very, very revered man in the community, very well respected. But I'm pretty sure that's where he's buried.
An anonymous attendee says that they liked that you had information about Mary's friend in Leiden. And Karen says, thank you. This was very interesting. Teresa wants to know if you have any information about the captain of the ship.
A little bit. He was first of all, I didn't use the word captain for people who ran ships back then. They were called sea masters. Captains was a military term. Sandage was a captain. Christopher Jones was not. It was a job. He'd never left Europe. He'd been sailing all up and down the west coast of Europe for a long time. I think he was probably paid pretty well to do it. And he was a very skilled sailor, fortunately, because they ran into some really challenging things. At first, he was very gruff. He didn't want these people on his ship. He was used to hauling goods and not people. He particularly didn't want the women and children on the ship. But over time, as they weathered one crisis after another together, he began to soften. And at the end, he took pity on them and said, I'll take any of you back that want to go back. This is, are you sure you want to stay here? And they all said, no, we're staying here, including a couple of people that intended to go back because they were kind of the hired help for the ship. And they decided they're going to stay. And I think John Alton was in that category.
Pat and Christine say, thank you. Diane notes that Family Search is affiliated with the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, and a lot of Family Search affiliated libraries here in Massachusetts. For those who live near or around Tewksbury, I was just actually doing this research recently. Billerica, Chelmsford, Dracut, Linfield, Andover, all libraries that offer familysearch.org. They're official affiliated libraries. The Family Search is not taking on additional affiliated libraries at the moment, but I believe there's like 30 or so in Massachusetts, including several in the area of Tewksbury. Mary Lynn says, thank you to Kathryn. Diane says that she's had good luck with Family Search. Joanne wants to know, you said that Bishop John Robinson is interred in Leiden. How and when did he go back?
John Robinson was part of the Scrooby group, and he and Clifton were actually classmates at Cambridge. That was kind of the birthplace of a lot of nonconformist ideas. And so he went with them. They all went to Amsterdam at first. Richard Clifton was the designated pastor. John Robinson was the designated teacher. Elder William Brewster was the designated elder. And then when they decided they were not going to stay in Amsterdam, Richard Clifton stayed behind, thinking that he could maybe be a peacemaker of some kind or other. So Robinson and Brewster and many others came down to Leiden. And at that point, Robinson became the designated pastor of the congregation, and William continued as the elder. They tapped a couple of other people to be basically deacons. I think Fuller was one of their deacons, Samuel Fuller. He wasn't a bishop, he was a pastor. They wouldn't actually have wanted bishops. They were trying to get back to the first century where you didn't have all this hierarchy. He had hoped to come, but it just didn't work out. I can't remember what year he died. I have it in my notes. I just don't have it in my head. But he died in Leiden. He and Brewster never got to see each other again. They had to settle for sending letters back and forth, which could take anywhere from a few months to a year or more to get a letter back and forth.
Sure. So we've hit 8:05. I think we're going to slowly wind it down here. So folks, let's give Kathryn one more big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. Just to note that on Wednesday, August 21st, so in about 6 or 7 weeks, we're hosting a UMass Lowell professor. He's actually the chair of the history department. He'll be talking about his new book, War and Colonization in the Early American Northeast. Specifically, though, his talk is on the exploration of pre-Columbian North America. So I'm somewhat semi-related to tonight's talk, and I will put information about that in the chat right now. But lots of folks in the chat giving you your flowers. Kathryn, do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap it up tonight?
I just want to say that the publishers will give a discount for book clubs or other groups that want to order a quantity of 10 or more sent to the same address. Shipping is an issue today, but if we can ship to just one address, we can offer a pretty significant discount. And I can do various versions of this for book clubs. I'm going to be doing one in Nebraska later this month, and I've done one out in California. So, you know, one good thing out of the pandemic is we all learned how to use Zoom.
Here we go, just about. So that's excellent. And folks, I would encourage you to encourage your local library to purchase copies of Kathryn's books if they haven't already. So folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to the recording, a link to a feedback survey, information about some other upcoming virtual programs, information about our Adult Summer Reading Challenge. And Kathryn, if you want to send me the resources slides, I can include those as well. So thank you all so much. And I hope everyone enjoys the 4th of July. Have a good night, everyone. Have a good night, Kathryn. Thanks again.
Thank you, Robert, so much. It's been fun.
Excellent. Bye-bye.